Hello everyone, welcome to episode 174 of Show For You, where today we'll be going over the Eye of the Midnight Sun encounter arc of Black Clover. Now, to kind of correct a thing I forgot to mention in the previous video, which is very important, the group that Valtos and Sally were a part of is entitled The Eye of the Midnight Sun. And this arc obviously focuses around them pretty, I guess, stringently. But yeah, so after the events of that, we end up seeing as, I believe it's Finral, it's Finral, Luck, and Asta, who end up going to a mixer. And we see as they're having their time, and it's not going really well, but ultimately we see as Asta ends up kicking it off with this girl by the name of Rebecca. And him and Rebecca end up kicking off because they both have a lot of siblings. And we see that Rebecca, in fact, cares for all of her siblings because she has no parents, and she's the only one who can work and do all the tasks and all that. So we see as everything kind of plays out. We also see as Noelle is spying on him because Noelle is worried that Rebecca's going to take her spot, I guess, even though Noelle is still kind of denying her feelings for Asta. We see as this plays out, and ultimately we see as Rebecca ends up inviting him over, and they end up chilling for a bit. And we see as he's introduced to her siblings and everything. And ultimately, we see as this leads to, Gauche, who is one of the Black Bulls, also ends up going to that area because he wants to meet up with his sister, Marie, because obviously he's the one that's, I guess, fully enthralled by his sister. So we see is ultimately they end up getting in the same area, and Marie and Asta actually end up having an encounter, and this ends up with Gauche end up, I guess, being outraged at Asta for just being around her and talking with her and all that. And ultimately, we see as Marie says that she's going to marry Asta in a very childish manner, obviously. And this gets Gauche mad. So we see he attacks him and all that. And ultimately, after this, we see as the nun of the church, where the orphanage where Marie stays, by the name of Theresa. It's not Teresa, it's Theresa, or Theresa, whatever. I'm going to say Theresa because that sounds cooler. But nah, I know it probably isn't right, but Theresa sounds really cool. So we see as Theresa and Rebecca end up going yo, the kids are gone. They've disappeared, and everyone then searches for them because they have no clue where they could be. But ultimately, we see, in fact, that Gauche ended up giving his sister, Marie, a mirror, because Gauche uses, mirror magic, and he'd given her a mirror to protect her from any possible magical attacks, and so he could, track her down. And so we see, as ultimately she ended up getting captured by this dude by the name of Neige. Now, Neige just wanted friends, so that's why he captured the kids, because he wanted a bunch of friends, but they were all under his magic, so they weren't truly his friends. And we see that he really didn't do it for that cause. In fact, he captured all these children to satisfy the needs of his brother, Barrow, who needed their magic. He was siphoning off their magic and all of that. Possibly, I guess, debilitating their magical abilities for the rest of their lives. And so we see then, as everyone prepares to go on and save the kids now that they know where they are. So we see as Gauche, Asta, and Theresa end up pulling up, and we see that, in fact, Theresa is a magic user. She is a flame wielder, and we learn later on that Theresa was, in fact, the leader of a Magic Knights group. She was a Magic Knights captain for a time. Well, I don't know if she's exactly a captain. I know she was a member of the Magic Knights for a time, and she was actually, I guess, the one who kind of tutored Fuego, who we saw previously get his arm cut off and all that. So that's really cool. And we see ultimately as they kind of put the beat down on Barrow and Neige, and this leads to them, like I said, kind of getting beat up very badly. And we see as they ultimately prepare to kind of take in Barrow, since Barrow is kind of the one more behind it. But then we see as Sally ends up coming in. Now, Sally is the one who previously was wanting to experiment on Asta, and she's here because she wants to get Asta. So we see as she ultimately ends up coming in. We see they try to attack her and fight her, but due to her magic, Gauche's magic is not really able to penetrate it, and we see they're having difficulties with this, but ultimately they end up doing pretty well. But this then leads to Sally turning Barrow into this big mud monster based on his mud magic. She ends up healing him, but she ends up doing overdoing it a little bit, and this leads to him turning into this massive mud monster that they're having a lot of difficulty fighting. But ultimately we see as they do end up successfully beating them, though through a lot of strain. And during this, we see as they're ultimately prepared to take in all of them, but then suddenly we see as they are pierced through with blades of light, and everything seems to be going bad now, because everyone's getting hit. We see as Gauche is hit, we see as Theresa is presumably dead, and all this seems to be going very bad. We see as Asta gets his leg penetrated by this light magic, and then we see who it is. This is Licht, or Licht, however you want to say it. It's L-I-C-T. It's L-I-C-H-T. I'm calling him Licht. But yeah, so we see Licht, and he is the head of all of the Eye of the Midnight Sun. So he is, like I said, big head honcho, and this is not looking good now. And so we see, like I said, this plays out, and ultimately we see then as someone comes in to save the day. We see as Fenrir uses his spatial magic to bring him and Yami, the leader of the Black Bulls, into this area to fight Licht. So then we see as Fenrir starts to help everyone kind of escape, tries to help all the kids escape and everything, leaving predominantly just Asta and Yami to fight. We do see as Gauch ends up staying for a little bit. Ultimately, he decides to save Marie, and then ends up going back after Marie kind of guilt trips him into like helping more and more people, which he ends up goes away, like helping the kids a little bit and everything. And we see as Theresa is ultimately transported away so she can be healed because she's in a dire condition, though she did phenomenally throughout the battle prior to the arrival of Licht. But yeah. So we see then as the battle between Licht, Yami, and Asta, Licht, Yami, and Asta begins. And this fight is phenomenal. It's a great fight. We ultimately end up learning a lot about Yami, and Yami most certainly became my favorite character in all of Black Clover during this arc. It was phenomenal. We learned that, in fact, he is a foreigner in the Clover Kingdom from a land known as the Land of the Rising Sun, which is obviously just the Black Clover version of Japan. And I mean, I don't it might have been, no, it was called the Land of the Rising Sun, not just the Land of the Sun. Well, it might have been. I don't remember exactly the name. But it's obviously a ripoff of Japan. We see that he wields a katana because he got it from his homeland. And in fact, he wields black magic. Now, not black magic, dark magic. This dark magic is essentially a type of magic that negates other forms of magic. And we see that he goes very well against Licht because Licht is a light magic wielder. And he's able to fight well against him. We see as he ends up pulling like black holes to absorb his magic and everything. And we also get introduced to a new mechanism in the power system. Ki. Just like in Dragon Ball, Ki is essentially a sense that allows you to feel things without actually using your senses. Like actually using all of your senses, but it's kind of like predicting in a way, really, because we see as Asta ultimately tries to learn it, but he fails. But then he ultimately like closes his eyes and then just feels it and essentially predicts the moves done by Voltos, because Voltos does end up pulling up, and that is then Asta's opponent. And after he acquires his ability of Ki, only after 2 tries, we see that he's able to beat Voltos. And this obviously then enrages Licht, but I'll kind of focus on that a little bit later. But yeah, so Yami learned Ki in his homeland, then he introduced it to Asta. Now Asta is even more powerful because of his acquisition of Ki. But yeah, so we see as this fight plays out. And ultimately, it does seem dire at times, but Yami, he keeps on the up. Like, Yami is doing great. And ultimately, Yami is able to beat Licht, and this ends up turning out very well. So we see as he prepares to take in Licht, and he prepares to use this magic to bind him, but then this does not go according to plan. We see as 3 people end up coming out of nowhere. They've been spawned in through spatial magic, and their names are Raya, Veto, and Fauna. These are, I believe they're called the Third Eye. They are the most powerful combatant forces in the Eye of the Midnight Sun. And they end up pulling up and start fighting Yami. And Yami's able to hold his own, kind of, but he would not have been able to last long if a certain group hadn't ended up showing up. And so we see this, and then we see also, well, actually that doesn't happen yet, but we see then as to combat these new arriving forces that our own forces arrive. We see as some other Magic Knights end up pulling up. We see Jack the Ripper, who is a new one we haven't seen. We get to see, I believe it's Nozzle Silva, and Charlotte. She's the Blue Roses Magic Captain, who reveals to have a crush on Yami, though she is like stringently against men, but except for Yami. But yeah, so we see that. And ultimately, they begin to fight the Third Eye, or the 3 members of the Third Eye. And they're doing very well against them. Like, they are keeping up. And we see that Asta and Yami take their chance during this time to deal with Licht to finish him off. So we see as Yami ends up pulling up and attacking Licht, like, he really thought that would work on me. And, oh yeah, also I forgot to mention, before the Third Eye pulled up, I know this is a very big thing, but before the Third Eye pulled up, we saw as Licht prepared to perform, like, this massive magical attack. And he was able to, Yami would have died. Yami would have absolutely died. Yami and Asta would have died if they would have got hit by this. But ultimately, it was able to be deflected when Gauch ended up, or Gauch, whatever you want to call it, ends up pulling back up and using his mirror magic to reflect it back at Licht. And this is what ultimately ends up defeating Licht and then leading to the arrival of the Third Eye. Back to this, Yami ends up trying to attack Licht, and Licht's like, what? You really thought that was going to work on me? But in fact, it was not Yami who was planning to attack him, it was Asta. And we see as Asta pulls up and was unable to be sensed because of his lack of magic, and ends up whapping Licht, and then Licht is obviously defeated after this. But then this activates some type of sealing magic, which ultimately ends up sealing Licht away in like some type of slumber. Yeah, also I forgot to mention, Licht had a 4-leaf clover grimoire, which isn't really important. It just shows that he's a very powerful magic wielder. But yeah, he has a 4-leaf grimoire, and we see that this sealing magic is then performed on him. But then we see as the other three are ultimately kind of starting to get beat back because they got distracted by the sealing of Licht, and then they ultimately all end up escaping because they do admit defeat here, but they're like, no, once we get back and we're full power, you will be defeated. But yeah, so after that, we see as everything's kind of hunky dory, everyone's healing. We see as Gauch ends up going back and getting healed. We see as Theresa is kind of under critical condition, but ultimately she ends up getting healed, and her and Gauch end up kind of making amends. And then we see as Asta and Yami are called to have an audience with the Wizard King. We see then as Asta is kind of requested to be with the Wizard King and go help, what's his name, Marks, who's the interrogator for the Wizard King. And we see as he then goes in and uses his anti-magic to break kind of like the lock on the two, her name was, what was her name? Catherine and the other like rogue dude who they captured in the previous arc, to break like the lock on their mind and memories. And ultimately we see then as they start harvesting information from them. And then we see as the Wizard King ends up bringing in all the Knights captains, or the Magic Knights captains, and they all come in, and ultimately he's like, okay, we end up reading all their memory, and he already knew that someone had betrayed him, but we see then he's like, okay, now reveal who the traitor is, and we see that he is in fact someone that we haven't seen really a lot of. His name is Poizot, his last name is Poizot, and he is, I believe he was the captain of the Purple Orcas, and ultimately we see as he tries to, I guess, fight against these, he ends up using his invisible magic, but ultimately Asta's able to hunt him down using Ki, and he blasts him, and they ultimately end up capturing him, but then he escapes and everything kind of goes off. But ultimately we in fact see that this was the real Poizot, or it might not have been the real Poizot, because Ryo was actually in there using clone magic, so I really don't know what happened with that, but I guess we'll figure it out eventually. But yeah, so after that, we see as once again everyone's kind of like healing up and all of that. We see as Theresa, like I said, and Gauch ultimately end up making amends. We see as Marie is like happy and all of that, and they end up planning to head off because now Gauch is taking Marie. Also, I kind of forget to like glance over Gauch's backstory, but Gauch was apparently, well, he got orphaned at a very young age, and this ultimately led to him caring for Marie, but he ended up getting in prison because of his actions to help care for Marie. But then ultimately Yami ended up encountering him once he had escaped, and then took him into the Black Bulls. Also, we got some brief backstory on Yami as well. We learned that after he pulled up on the mainland of the Clover Kingdom, he ended up running in with Julius Novachrono, who was the Wizard King, or wasn't the Wizard King at the time, and this is how he ultimately ended up getting in the Magic Knights and all that after acquiring a grimoire as a foreigner. But yeah, so we see all that, and we see as Asta's kind of preparing to leave off and go back to the home of the Black Bulls and all that, and he's kind of saying his goodbyes to Rebecca, and Rebecca ultimately notices that she in fact probably can't compete with Noelle, since Noelle can actually stand beside Asta and fight, and she can't do that because she's not a magic wielder. But ultimately she decides to take Asta's first kiss, gives him a nice little peck on the cheek, and Noelle's like flabbergasted by this and everything, and we see as Asta is as well, but Asta, he's locked in. He knows that the sister back in Hage is waiting for him whenever he becomes the Wizard King. But yeah, we actually got a name drop for her, but I can't remember what her name was in this arc. But yeah, so that's the real one for Asta. But yeah, that's what it really was for the, I can't even remember, that was a long odd name, the Encounter of the Eye of the Midnight Sun arc, or whatever it was. But yeah, so I really enjoyed this arc. This arc was great, and I believe like each arc in Black Clover is progressively getting better and better, and I did really enjoy the Royal Capital Assault arc, but I believe this one's just a tad bit better because it did give me some exposition on who is now my favorite character, which is Yami. And I cannot wait to see more from Yami because I believe he will be taking a more present role now that he has kind of made his foray into the story at this point. Now, I believe we're kind of done introducing, because like each of the arcs really from now have been, since the beginning, have been used to kind of introduce the characters in the Black Bulls, and we've already been kind of fully introduced to everyone besides like Finral kind of, but I don't know if we'll get a full arc to introduce Finral, because Finral's like been present a lot of the time, but like they've never given much exposition, so I'm really ready to see what they do with that, or what Tabata does with the, oh my gosh, does with that. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far. I believe I'm at chapter 58 now. Yeah, wait, no, 57. So I left off directly where the arc ends, and I'm chucking through it pretty fast. Cause like I said, I'm really enjoying it, and I can't wait to read more. Like I said, that's all there really is for that arc, and that's all I really have for episode 174 of Show for you. So thank you very much for watching.